Mirë se erdhët në Public Square. Unë jam Ditmir Bushati. Në muajin shkurt, Turqia u godit nga një prej tërmeteve më të rënda në historinë e saj. Numri zyrtarit vdekurve është mbi 50.000. Që nga tërmeti i vitit 1999, i cili shkaktoi më shumë se 17.000 të vdekur, Turqia ka përjetuar një bum të madh ndërtimesh. Ajo është shndruar një lojtar me peshë për sa i përket ndihmës humanitare dhe një fuqi ushtarake rajonale gjithnjë e më e rëndësishme. Aso kohë, kritikat e përhapura ndaj keq administrimit dhe mungesës së kapaciteteve shtetërore, gjatë dhe pas tërmetit, sikundër krizës ekonomike që i pasoi atë në vitin 2001, kontribuan në ndryshime tektonike në peizazhin politik. Më kryesorja prej tyre ishte ngjitja në pushtet e Partisë për Drejtësi dhe Zhvillim, e cila drejton vendin që prej vitit 2002. Kështu, tërmeti i shkurtit testoi shkallën e zbatueshmërisë së ligjit dhe politikave të vënë jetë gjatë 2 dekadave të fundit. Tërmeti riktheu në debatin publik turk kritikat për lidhjen ndërmjet sistemit rentier ndërtimit dhe financimit jetës politike, mungesën e zbatimit ligjeve, dobësinë e kapaciteteve shtetërore dhe mospërgjigjen adekuate të ushtrisë, si pasojë mbi ngarkesës së saj nga fushatat ndërkombëtare. Krahas fatkeqësive njerëzore, trashëgimia e pashmangshme e tërmeteve është dëmi i tyre ekonomik. Zonat e prekura në jug dhe lindje të Turqisë janë rreth 15% e popullsisë së vendit, që kontribuon në afërsisht 9% të produktit brendshëm bruto. Mirëpo Turqia po përballet me pasojat e tërmetit në një moment kur ekonomia po përjeton normat më të larta të inflacionit në botë, si pasojë aplikimit të një politike ekonomike të bazuar në stimulimin e rritjes dhe frenimin e papunësisë në kurriz të stabilitetit makroekonomik dhe kontrollit të inflacionit. Mënyra e administrimit të pasojave të tërmetit pritet të ketë ndikim në zgjedhjet presidenciale dhe parlamentare të 14 majit. Për diskutuar rreth parashikimeve nga ky proces i rëndësishëm dhe vizioneve politike që ballafaqohen në Turqi, i ftuar i sotëm në Public Square është një prej mendimtarëve më të spikatur të Turqisë, me reputacion ndërkombëtar, Sinan Ülgen. Ai është themeluesi i Istanbul Economics dhe kryetar i bordit të qendrës për studime ekonomike dhe politikë të jashtme. Dear Sinan, it's a pleasure to have you as my guest in the Public Square and to discuss a little bit together the situation after the earthquake in Turkey. As well as to have a discussion about the parliamentary and presidential elections and how the recent developments will affect the outcome of those elections.
Thank you for hosting me. Yes, the earthquake indeed was the largest ever recorded in Turkish history, and the casualty is largest ever unfortunately related to a natural disaster. The numbers are likely to be above 50,000 casualties and still increasing. But there also, as Albania has also experienced most tragically in 2019, the aftermath of the earthquake, with people having been left without shelter, without food. This is quite a big geography. We're talking about 11 provinces that have been affected, 3 of them in a major way. So there is a lot to be done as an initial disaster relief operation. But more broadly, there is another dimension to this. There was a sizable earthquake in the Marmara region in 1999, close to Istanbul. And now many of the geologists believe that there is an earthquake that could hit Istanbul in the years to come. Of course, nobody can say with a degree of confidence when that will happen. But now it's more a matter of when rather than a matter of if. And therefore, this earthquake in the southeast of the country has rekindled the debate on the effort, the need to enhance Turkey's cities' resilience to another such natural disaster. And this is going to be one of the main themes of the political campaign for Turkey, both the presidential and parliamentary elections.
I read your recent piece for the Carnegie Europe, where basically you speak about the need for the Turkish society to face with uncomfortable truths. Is Turkey going through a critical domestic debate about governance, about resilience and the response to the earthquake? When you compare 1999 with February's earthquake, what are your main points?
My main points would be that unfortunately the lessons learned after 1999 have essentially been forgotten, both by the political leadership, but also more broadly by Turkish society. So that what needed to be done on the basis of the experience of the 1999 earthquake, which was to enhance the resilience of the cities, create funding mechanism that would facilitate households to be able to do that, to do zoning laws in accordance with that objective. All of that were essentially were left by the side of the road. Instead, populist tendencies have prevailed over time, so much so, for instance, that we have seen over the past 20 years at least 7 bills that have aimed to bring amnesty laws for informal buildings, for buildings that have built in non-compliance with building regulations. So governments introduced these bills, and Turkish society voted for those governments. Actually, it was the AK Party government since the beginning of 2002, obviously. But nonetheless, it did receive the backing of the Turkish population. So now the debate has shifted. There is a new consciousness that a major new effort is needed, not only in terms of the disaster relief in the affected zones, but also to prepare the rest of Turkey, particularly the metropolitan areas, to a new calamity, build resilience there. And hopefully this consciousness will essentially prevent these type of populist measures in the future so that Turkey can travel on the right path.
Are you saying that Turkey is following somehow the Japanese model?
Of course, Japan is the gold standard here. When you look at how they have managed to really mitigate the consequences of large earthquakes. So how did Japan succeed? It's certainly part of their social contract. The building codes are, have been modified, but also it's really a matter of finding the financial means to transform cities. And this is going to be a bottleneck for Turkey, given that Turkey does not have the same financial means as Japan.
How would you assess the response and solidarity coming from various actors, namely from the West, US, Germany, and how would you compare this solidarity and the response with solidarity or response coming from East or from other partners of Turkey?
Yes, there has been a very commendable international mobilization from the very early days of the earthquake. We have seen about 100 countries coming to Turkey's assistance. About 85 of them sent teams to help with disaster relief efforts. Others have sent assistance. And this has really been quite a very broad coalition. Of course, major nations in the West, given that they have a higher capacity, were, providing a large part of that assistance. But even countries in Africa, like Somalia, like Ethiopia, came to Turkey's assistance with their limited means. So we've seen really a very broad coalition coming having mobilized. When you look at the geographical spread, a lot of this has been provided by the Western family of nations, particularly European countries and United States. For instance, on China and Russia, the Eastern countries have been less visible in this aid portfolio.
Do you think that this is reflecting also the foreign policy that has been pursued by Turkey in the recent years, in the last decade, as a country that has positioned itself between, let's say, various winds and channels as a regional power?
No, I don't think so. I think that this has been quite disconnected from the general evolution of Turkish foreign policy, which has been trying to find a balance between East and West, between its traditional allies in the West, and try to develop relations with the rising powers in the East, including Russia and to some extent China, although a bit less so. Because what we've seen actually in terms of the numbers, in terms of the teams on the ground, has been really more heavily skewed towards Turkey's traditional partners in the West, and less so from the other nations. So I think, and really another case in point is that we've also seen countries where Turkey's bilateral ties have been difficult or problematic, including Armenia, including Greece, or even Israel, that were part of this major effort. So I think the international mobilization is quite disconnected from the general direction of Turkish foreign policy.
Turkey, even before the earthquake, was experiencing some economic difficulties. How do you see now the impact of earthquake, given this economic context that Turkey was going through?
Yes, Turkey was indeed, under a degree of economic duress, but frankly speaking, most of this is self-induced. It has come about as a result of mistakes, macro policy mistakes, like interest rate policy. Turkey's advantage, to some extent, is that it still has a strong fiscal stance. When you look at fiscal balances in Turkey, Turkey has a relatively low public debt to GDP ratio. We're talking about 35% of public debt to GDP, which is quite advantageous compared to many other European countries, where you have almost triple digits in terms of the public debt to GDP ratio. So that's the major advantage of Turkey going forward, is that it has fiscal space. Namely, the government will need to spend, and we have seen different estimates about the size of the economic loss. I think a fair estimate is around $100 billion. So ultimately, yes, the Turkish state, the Turkish government will need to allocate higher funding to this region for disaster relief and disaster management. But at the same time, like all fiscal spending, this type of fiscal spending will also have a positive impact on growth. Whichever government's elected, it's a sure thing that there will need to be more money spent in that region after the disaster.
I would be very interested to have your views about the political implications of the earthquake, first, for the parliamentary and presidential elections, and second, there is again a new reality that the opposition seems to be more united than it was a few months ago. There are two competing visions or two choices: stability and continuity, or change. So I would like to hear your view about that.
Let me start with the earthquake, how the earthquake is going to have an impact, or the political impact of the earthquake. There we need to perhaps think along two parameters. One, with regard to the region which was hit by the earthquake, where there is a dire need, given the size of the population that's been affected, to provide basic services, starting with shelter, food, medical services, and so on. It's going to be very difficult for any government, not just the Turkish government, to really provide this level or address these needs in a timely manner. But I think there will be a degree of political backlash inevitably, given the size of this tragedy. But the more politically perhaps important question is what happens in the rest of the country. There is a discussion about preparing Turkey's major metropolitan areas to a potential earthquake. And when you look at the distribution of the vote, the electorate, this is where, you know, a very big part of the electorate lives in big cities, in Istanbul and Izmir, Ankara as well, but Ankara is less affected by the earthquake. But Istanbul, Izmir certainly are. So there is going to be a contest between the government and the opposition to convince the electorate that they are a better choice to prepare Turkey for the next earthquake. And this is also where the opposition has an edge, because the government has been in power for the past 20 years. It was their job to prepare Turkey to an earthquake. And their performance, as we've seen in this tragedy, certainly leaves a lot to be desired. So they will have difficulty in arguing that they are the right choice, because they have not done that, at least in a proper way, in the past 20 years.
When it comes to the foreign policy and specifically to the relations of Turkey with the US and the European Union, if there is a change, if there is a political change, can we say or can we expect that earthquake paradoxically could bring Turkey closer to European Union or back to the EU path?
There is indeed that prospect, but not particularly because of the earthquake. There is that prospect because this is what the opposition has in its program, which is their common policy platform, where they clearly highlight that they will be willing to reassert Turkey's Western vocation, to rebuild Turkey's ties with the Western community of nations. And they are going to back this with democratic reforms at home in order to expand the scope of fundamental freedoms and improve the rule of law at home, which incidentally can only have a positive impact on this foreign policy objective. Of course, some of that will also depend on how the West will react to the prospect of political change in Turkey. If the government party, Erdoğan, wins, then I would expect more of the same situation of the more balanced approach between the West and other countries in the east of Turkey, where Turkey has tried to create itself a space of almost strategic autonomy.
If there is a change, do you expect Turkey to be part of other candidate countries of EU, to be part of the sanctions policy of the West against Russia?
The policy towards Russia will change. No Turkish leader will have the same type of relationship with Putin as Erdoğan. However, I would not expect Turkey to align itself with sanctions policy on Russia, even if there is government change in Turkey. And the reason for that is that across the board, in a bipartisan manner, Turkey understands the need to have a diplomatic engagement with Russia because of its own security concerns in the region. And here I'm particularly talking about Syria. And Turkey needs that to continue because it does not want to face yet another wave of refugees, for instance. So that's the fundamental reason why, even with the new government, Turkey is not likely to side with the sanctions policy, but it will be a more distant relationship. And certainly not as personal as the one that we've seen between Putin and Erdoğan.
I know you have been part of the international experts group established by former Secretary General of NATO Rasmussen. You wrote also a piece at Project Syndicate last year where you basically explained in a diplomatic way the position of Turkey vis-à-vis open door policy. Is there any political debate about NATO's open door policy?
In principle, Turkey has firmly backed the open door policy, and in Albania you have experienced Turkey's stance in backing this type of policy. So there's no real debate, there's no change in the general stance towards open door policy. The issue with Finland and Sweden were that the Turkish government had essentially concerns about the stance of these countries on the fight to curtail the influence of terrorist organizations, and here I'm particularly referring to the PKK. So this was a long-standing issue between Turkey and Sweden, particularly a bit less so with Finland, regardless of the NATO accession. Now, when these countries decided to apply for NATO membership, of course, it was to some degree natural for Turkey to try to bring pressure on those countries to change their attitude and to change their behavior on what Turkey considers to be its main security threat. This is what an alliance means. But in all likelihood, the accession of Sweden will be taken up after elections. There are still outstanding issues with regard to the commitments by Sweden. And I would tend to think that a new government would want to settle this problem before the Vilnius summit, given that the Vilnius summit will be probably the first major international event for the new Turkish government. They would want to go there with a positive message.
I have always defended the idea that when we discuss about the so-called third actors in our neighborhood, we should not make the mistake of putting Turkey on that basket, because Turkey, at the end of the day, it's the biggest country in the Balkans. Where do you see Turkey, and what Turkey could do better in this respect?
Yes. Well, I mean, thank you for bringing that, and really, because sometimes people compare Turkey to Russia, China, non-EU actors in the Balkans, and I think that's the totally wrong basis of comparison. Turkey is part of the Balkans. It's not an external actor. Secondly, unlike Russia and China, Turkey has no challenging alternative model that it offers to the Balkan countries as a challenge to their EU accession. So Turkey is not there to provide them with an alternative to EU accession, to establish alliances that would pull countries out of that orbit, which is sometimes perhaps the objective of other external players. That's not what Turkey does. And indeed, when you look at Turkey's engagement, it's been mostly positive economically from the standpoint of human interaction, education, scholarships, and so on. Perhaps the one area where I maybe things may improve is that Turkey should also demonstrate clearly, and sometimes it has done perhaps a bit less of this, that it is not willing to take sides in the internal political races, in the internal political contests of the Balkan nations. So Turkey should make it clear that this is a nation-to-nation, government-to-government collaboration, and not necessarily a partisan one, which was the mistake that Turkish foreign policy did, most particularly in the Middle East, in countries like Egypt, for instance, where it backed the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, it's not the same, obviously, situation in the Balkans, but since you asked me where Turkish engagement could improve, I would say this is where it may need to improve to at least mitigate the perception that Turkey has backed or is willing to back one political actor over the other in the Balkan nations.
Before I let you go, Sinan, my very last question. I know you write and you read a lot. What is the book you are reading recently that you would like to share with Public Square?
Well, the latest book that I'm reading is a book by Kahneman and Kasmade. Kahneman, as you know, wrote this book, a very popular book before on the thought process, on thinking fast and slow. That was the title of his previous book, which became very popular. And now he has a new book with a co-author which is entitled Noise. And it basically allowed me to understand, what is noise, what is a bias, how do we differentiate, and basically how we need to be aware of this in order to get to a better, more balanced decision-making in our public lives, in our private lives, really all. So that's the book that I'm reading.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for hosting me. Always a pleasure.